Rick, welcome back to the program. It's been years.
Yes. Great to be here, Richard. Of course, we go way back. We were chatting. Long time listener, long time caller. I can hear the music in my ears right now.
Right, right. And I'm a longtime reader of you, so here we are. Let's start with you just published two pieces that were connected and to me evocative of a lot. We could go at them from so many angles, but
Yeah.
the first piece was headlined Dr. Strangekennedy. And it struck me for a number of reasons. I really resonated with it. One was, first of all, you're the first person other than myself that I know of who connected all this talk about, bodily purity and this RFK rhetoric about what they're putting in our bodies with Dr. Strangelove and how they're polluting our precious bodily fluids, the general
Purity of essence, Richard. Purity of essence.
purity of essence.
You ever seen a commie take a drink of water?
Right. I do not avoid the company of women, Mandrake, but I do deny them my essence. And yes, and you're right. That to me was an important point for you to bring up. And you connected it with a kind of incipient fascism, which I thought was fascinating. You pointed out that let me see if I can find the quote now. Whatever you say of RFK, whatever the original tributaries of his ideas, these purity of essence ideas, and by the way, among them is now a new campaign against fluoride. When I was a child, the John Birch Society
Exactly.
famously said it was a communist plot. They have etched a mind that is right wing in its deepest structures. I found this fascinating. It's almost Nazi like. And of course, Nazis promoted certain forms of exercise, vegetarianism, and so on. Everything you write, everything Kennedy says about health presumes the existence of two kinds of human beings, one pure and superior, the other impure and inferior. And I think there's quite a bit to that. How did that come into your head, if you can remember?
How did that come into my head? That's an interesting question. Well, I mean, there's this weird esoteric thing that, only someone who's been writing about the history of the right as long as I have, would know that this culture of pure food, of quote unquote health food, the idea that kind of the normal food that normal people eat may be adulterated in ways that the bad guys might be want to control us with, has these kind of 1950s, 1960s far right roots, right? So I kind of knew that. And in the piece, I, even mentioned this surreal moment when I was interviewing Phyllis Schlafly, the great far right organizer who's single handedly responsible for organizing against the Equal Rights Amendment, but of course got her started in the McCarthy era and was big with Barry Goldwater. I interviewed her for my first book about Barry Goldwater during the purity of essence kind of fluoride, Dr. Strangelove era. And she suddenly went off on this tangent about how she only fed her kids a certain kind of grain for breakfast, and she just talked about food as this vector for pollution. So it was almost like one of these bridges across the decades, and it was only later that the people they called hippies picked up this culture. So I had that in mind, and I also am very interested in how conservatism, and this is another kind of theme of the piece, has a guilty conscience built into it. Why no conservative is going to say, I want a society in which the bosses are on top and the workers are on the bottom and the white people are on top and the people of color are on the bottom. But they'll always frame it in language that's humanitarian and progressive. Even Christopher Rufo saying he's fighting racism against white people, right? Instead of saying I'm a racist.
Right.
Because and I have a quote from George Orwell writing about Charles Dickens to this effect. Humanitarianism is kind of the official ideology of the modern world.
Right.
We live in caves, and we used to be serfs, and women used to be slaves. And, we just figure out more and more and better ways for people to be free. And this freaks conservatives out, but they can always pick some kind of freedom movement from previous generations and say, we're for that, so we're not bad people, right? We're really for the Martin Luther King, who was there on the mall saying, we're going to judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, when at the time, they were the kind of people who were answering polls and saying, 90% of Americans said they wouldn't want their daughter, dating a black person, right? So that's also, and then also that purity is so much of a part of purity, and disgust are so much a part of conservative politics, right? So now it's disgust at, the private parts of trans people, right? It used to be disgust at the private parts of gay people. Before that, it was disgust at the private parts of black people who just want to, rape women. So this logic of purity goes very deep. And also this opportunism to find language that makes, things that are really about control, because RFK, we can get into this, is really ultimately about control, and to phrase it in terms of liberty and dignity and equality. So it's kind of been bubbling up for a while. And this shocking, announcement that a guy who, believes that, 5G cell phones are a mind control plot, right? Who has said that everyone in the nutrition division of the Food and Drug Administration should be summarily fired for poisoning our children, should be held up as, well, maybe he kind of has a point. Because that's the seductive nature of this kind of logic, this Hitler's pretty bad, but that Autobahn, man, I can go really fast, or, it's so great, but look, these trains are finally running on time,
Right. Or as Mel Brooks said, Hitler was a great painter. He could do a whole apartment in 2 hours. But the you go from, and that's another one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about this, Rick, because I think it's important. I run into a lot of people who say, he's Bobby Kennedy. He's saying some good things,
Right.
liberals, progressives, and I think that's important. But all of it, the picture that you paint, at least as I read it, is kind of the totalitarian American as, flagellant, as sort of going through the passion play, but whipping himself at the same time. And this desire to subjugate your own body. And you can see that, in the way, for example, RFK Jr. likes to put out pictures of himself shirtless, showing that he's making his body and his muscles. We're the same age, he and I, and but needless to say, I do not do that. And you then extend it into the political sphere, which I think is exactly right. That just as there are two types of people, there are two types of governments: one that protects the purity of the superior subjects with things like vaccine choice; the other that forces impure foreign substances into.
By vaccine choice, you mean allowing deadly pathogens that kill millions of people and could kill 10 millions of people next time to roam free.
Right, and my theory about that resistance, that sense of resistance, I don't know. I think it kind of overlaps with yours, and I'm willing to yield to you on this one because I think you make a compelling case. But my theory all along has been that a lot of resistance to vaccines is really an issue of autonomy. And that in a society and a political culture where people don't have the kind of decision making they'd like over their own lives,
take it where we can get it.
Take it where we can get it, and by God, you're not sticking that needle in me.
And that's one of the tricky things about being, liberal and on the left, and kind of believing in, the Enlightenment in this day and age, is that we live in a complex world and you can't know everything, and really to be a healthy, functioning, thriving person And society, you have to defer to these people called experts. And that's no fun, right? That's no fun. So let's just fire all the experts, right? And
Right.
just make all our own decisions. And one of the things that skips is that, at its best, and it's often, it is always need of reform, something like, the scientific method is a pretty darn democratic system for coming up with information. It's like the name that is attached doesn't matter. It's the data, it's the arguments, right? And it doesn't always work very well, and it's often unfair, right? But, it's one of these things when I've tried to kind of explain some of these abstract concepts to people, and I haven't really gotten any pushback from any RFK Jr. fans, but I really, just want to head that off. There was this wonderful saying from a very famous politician, a very wise politician whose name you'll recall, Sam Rayburn, who was the Speaker of the House, and he was the mentor of Lyndon Johnson, and he knew how to get things done in politics. He would say, any jackass can knock down a barn, but it takes a carpenter to build one. And what this RFK logic, which is very close to the Trump logic, means is firing all the carpenters. We'll just we'll just build the barns ourselves. But, these are the people, these, food nutritionists at the FDA, you could, go down the list, the scientists at the pharmaceutical companies who are, companies that are profiteering off people. There's no question, right? Are experts, right? They know what they're doing, and building that kind of infrastructure, that kind of institutional background that allows any of this stuff to exist is easy to get rid of and impossible to replace. So, I mean, you're really just talking about, like the conditions for, just mass death, nuclear scale death. I mean, you've probably read about, what it was like during the Black Death in the Middle Ages, in 15th century, 14th century, that you'd have a city that had 200,000 people, and it would have 50,000 people in a couple of years.
Right.
And then that's what happens with these pathogens.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I struggle with, Rick, is in terms of communicating all this, is that, and you alluded to it too, but, I've studied the sort of power structure of the pharmaceutical industry and the politics.
That was your field, I think, if I recall correctly.
What's that?
You were in the kind of medical.
I was in on the health insurance and financing side. And people have been deceived a lot, and mostly not by technical experts, but somewhat as well. And believe me, I'm not endorsing Bobby Kennedy when I say this. I'm just kind of discussing the
it's really fertile ground.
Fertile ground, exactly.
Alienation, disillusionment. Right. Great at that.
For example, there was a story reported that, and I'm sorry I can't cite specifics off the top of my head, but that Twitter, I think it was in the Twitter files, was asked to take down a link to a legitimate study showing that in some tiny percentage of vaccinations for COVID, there would be a certain adverse reaction.
Right.
Now, because I do know enough about medical information, I know that these are statistically insignificant. I also know that 4 cases in a country of 320 million people is going to flip people out because they don't understand numerical relationships. Yes. And will cause mass deaths. So I'm sympathetic if people refuse a vaccine. So I'm sympathetic to the impulse to suppress that story, but I have some understanding for people who hear that and say, well, I can't trust any of these bastards, fire them all. So I'm not sure where we go from there, but I think it creates an opening for a, if you will, strong man of the medical field.
One of the problems is, what creates an opening, unfortunately, is the scientific method itself. I did another piece for my column about why I agreed with Scientific American for endorsing Harris over Trump. And some people were saying, no, science has to remain neutral. And I said, look, these people the right have so politicized science. And I went back all the way to the era of AIDS. And I pointed out that the recommendations that scientists give, even the best faith ones who are just trying to save lives, will change all the time, right? because
Right.
information changes, right? Even something as kind of inherently political as public health recommendations will change all the time, and
Right.
sometimes they'll be stupid. I mean, telling people that they don't need masks because we have to save masks for the medical professionals, which Fauci did, is not the first big mistake Fauci made when it came to this stuff. He
Right.
actually said back in the era of AIDS that it could be spread by casual contact right around the time when scientists weren't quite sure whether it could or not, and caused a lot of panic, right? The messiness, again, just like we have the messiness of institutions, the messiness of bureaucracies, the fact that they're not perfect and it's easy to pull out mistakes. If you take the mistakes and make it into the
Right.
whole thing, it's a very easy way to fool people, right? Instead of, saying if we have this epidemic and information is going to move fast, recommendations are going to move fast, we got to extend a certain level of trust to people who are doing their best. Now, of course, there's not a lot of trust in society. And ultimately, what these people are about is increasing the level of distrust. It's kind of like the scientific version of Steve Bannon's "the way to hack the media is to just flood the zone with shit and make people
Right.
try something." And then basically the loudest, most kind of entertaining voices will be able to be the ones that are most persuasive. And if you can lie, by the way, it's easier to come up with a compelling story because you're not constrained by the truth, right? So ultimately, you get these guys like RFK Jr. who are going to be, just loading these public health bureaucracies after they fire all the competent, public spirited people with grifters, right? And as we know, there are just so many snake oil salesmen, literal,
Right.
literal snake oil, not just selling bad ideas, but dangerous substances that they make a killing on.
You
So
mean
that's
like Mehmet Oz, who will be joining the administration?
us, right?
Um, there's also a sort of secular slash theological dimension to all this, isn't there? You mentioned, for example, in your second piece that about Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Right.
that well, there are a couple things I want to get into, but you mentioned that among other things, the death of John F. Kennedy,
The
premature
fact that
death.
Robert F. Kennedy is such a trusted, he's such a perfect spokesman for this kind of stuff,
Right.
comes out of
And to me that has to do with that's a kind of a religious, every religion has its martyrs,
right.
and every religion has this kind of uh, lost utopia, lost paradise
Eden.
dimension, which
You're banished from Eden
you're
by the
banished from Eden, which for the boomer generation was the death of John F. Kennedy. That everything would have been, it would have been a beautiful, different world if John F. Kennedy had lived, and that gives a Bobby Kennedy. Because I was struck, for example, by the fact that you wrote that John Kennedy is the only former president with an approval rating almost as high among Republicans, 89%, as among Democrats. So you say, what you call high church republicanism. They insist JFK was really a conservative. I'll admit I didn't click on the link, but I assume that's because he lowered the top marginal tax rate.
Oh, you really wanted to fight the commies.
Right, and he wanted to fight the communists. And then the low church Republicans, the QAnon belief that JFK Jr. Faked his own plane crash death. It all feels very theological to me. It feels like
Yeah.
when you read about, ranters, like, in 14th century
Right.
England, overrunning
Yeah,
the
and
landscape.
theology, it's like, why do we believe in God? I mean, with all due respect to believers, right? There's plenty of, intelligent, humane people who have perfectly good, reasonable reasons to be religious. But one of the kind of more infantile ways that God becomes a character in a lot of people's lives is this inability to handle the cruelty of the world, right? And this picture of, this kindly man in the sky with a beard who really wants to do good for all of us, but is, only being prevented by this other guy who, has
Right.
horns and has a pitchfork, right? So the story for baby boomers was that, John F. Kennedy had in mind to, end the Vietnam War, end the Cold War, end racism in America. So of course the devil, the bad guys, Donald Trump's deep state really had to kill him. And that gave birth to a culture of people who used very creative, very motivated reasoning to come up with arguments that, in fact, they did kill him, that the CIA killed him, the mafia killed him. They all got together, right? And I still, I wrote about it yesterday, and I got some responses from people saying, "What do you mean this crime isn't solved? It wasn't this one guy." And, one of the reasons, again, it's those messy institutions. In fact, the people involved in, kind of trying to solve the crime of the Kennedy assassination and communicating that to us, they were liars. And the reason they lied was they wanted to close the case because people were terrified that if people found out that a communist had killed Kennedy and people got it in their mind that it was a conspiracy, that they would just clamor for a war against Russia, right? And that would end in a nuclear war. So, the Lyndon Johnsons of the world, the J. Edgar Hoovers of the world, the Earl Warrens of the world, the Arlitt Specters of the world, basically we're just like, we'll just throw this thing together and we'll put it out there and people will realize that, because we're the grown-ups in the room, that they can trust us and everything is going to be fine. But lo and behold, it was the 60s and people, for good reasons, were not really willing to trust their fathers or their symbolic fathers anymore. And yeah. And that gives birth to an idea that there's these malign forces in there who will do anything to stop the Redeemer, right? And the Redeemer then was Kennedy, and now it's Trump. But the logic is very similar.
Yeah, as for the assassination, there was a period in my life when I read copiously everything from, the theorists to the Warren Commission defenders. You've read more than I couldn't get anywhere with it. But where I'm clear, and you make this point very well, two things. One, that it did foster a kind of cult. And I made this, you and I made the same miscalculation, I interpret from what I read, for perhaps different reasons. But I remember in the Obama era writing something about, what I call the XFK factor, with X being, some X factor would be the next JFK, right? It'll be
RFK. Joe and Ted and John.
Right. Robert. And I assumed it was losing its magic then, because people were just maturing out of it and new generations were coming in that didn't have it. Right. You presumed that that this cult of, savior cult, which is really a kind of millennial savior cult, had lost its magic by 2024. But you right, I was wrong, and thereby hangs a tale. That would explain both Trump and the attraction to RFK, wouldn't it?
I think so. I think that in a lot of ways, the QAnon thing is a perfect example, right? The idea that one of their core fantasies, right, is that not only did JFK Jr. not die in a plane crash in the year 1999, he's actually Donald Trump's right-hand man. And this idea that, kind of JFK, right, JFK Jr. or JFK didn't really die, but kind of lives on and and a friend of mine actually, I'm not as deep in the weeds as some people following this stuff, but it turns out that there's this one guy who they think is JFK Jr. and he was actually present in Pennsylvania in the audience behind Donald Trump when he got shot. So there's a mythology that somehow John F. Kennedy Jr. was the guardian angel who saved Trump from the deep state's assassination attempt. That's how kind of bizarre this is.
No, there are Shia groups in Islam who believe that the final Imam, the Mahdi, has been alive for hundreds of years, but he is living in what they call, in translation, occultation. And so I guess these people are believing that John Kennedy Jr. is living in a
Those crazy Muslims, right?
No, I think they make a lot more sense than
Just as
people.
crazy as they are, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But I will say this, and I get in trouble saying this, Rick, but I'm really curious to your response. I remember telling someone I read a good book about QAnon, good piece of reporting called Trust the Plan. I don't know if you've read it, but uh, he starts out by pointing out that one of the core QAnon beliefs is that there are miles of tunnels underneath the Capitol where children are kept in darkness and force fed. There you go with your bodily purity again, all sorts of fattening foods and chemicals so that they can be devoured and exploited by elites. And, on the one hand, it's so insane as to be psychotic, but, and this is where I get into trouble, it has a kind of metaphorical truth to it.
Right.
If you think about it, I mean, you may think I'm insane, but people who haven't been given a template for interpreting all the crazy stuff that's happening to them, and they've seen their kids die of.
I mean, here's a guy who's shooting an insurance executive, maybe allegedly, right? Because he was, or someone close to him was, denied health insurance coverage.
Right.
A lot of stuff that are kind of normal. And this is kind of where we get into the kind of the Harris world and kind of the Democratic elites in our world. The kind of just like a rational story about the world isn't going to satisfy people. And charisma is important in politics. I mean, the reason, Barack Obama was able to get past a lot of this nonsense was because he did have a certain kind of Kennedy-esque charisma.
Definitely.
And you trust him and you love him, right? I think, and then the reason, the conspiracy, the dark side of charisma works, and I did specifically say that there's kind of like a light side of the Kennedy charisma, which is just basically that rich people can be liberals and they can pass good laws and they can be river defenders and all that good stuff. But there's a dark side of the force, which is the kind of thing we're talking about. The book that I got a lot of this stuff from, Wonderful History of Conspiracy Theories going back to the early 20th century, is called Real Enemies. It's by a historian named Catherine Olmsted. And the reason she uses the phrase real enemies is that even paranoids have real enemies. And if there wasn't so much secrecy in America, right, and there weren't so many people working behind the scenes to do bad things for people, these conspiracy theories wouldn't really get anywhere, because the feelings that they harvest, the feelings that they exploit, wouldn't, they wouldn't resonate. And one of the things that we can derive from this paradigm is how many of the conspiracy theories come from militarism, right?
Yes.
And the fact that the world of militarism in America is profoundly secretive. That, there's this guy who shows up in the White House press room every day and gaslights us, right? About what's happening in Israel, and what's happening in Gaza and what America is trying to do about it. And how can the most powerful people in the world show up on TV every day and say things that, a person who has a pretty good sense of when someone is bullshitting or not, not get a little bit of fodder to, wow, what's really going on here, right? So, I mean, the cure for conspiracy culture and the dark side of it is, more democratic transparency.
Right, more democratic, large capital D and small d. Democratic.
We're not going to get that from RFK Jr., and we're not going to get that from Trump, and we're not going to get that from Peter Hesgeth, and we're not going to get that from Fox News. They're just going to use all these again, real enemies in order to aggrandize themselves.
Yeah, and if people get anything from reading your two columns, which at the American Prospect, which I encourage them to do, I would want them to get that regardless of the mistakes of the Democrats, regardless of the long-term erosion of public trust, which you and I both have critiqued at length, breakdown of relationship between elites, and the whole list, regardless of that, these guys are not, oh, that's not so bad, is the wrong reaction to these people. These people, and I got this very strongly from your piece, and it was very well done. this is a totalitarian psychology
That's
which
right.
could play out in very dangerous ways.
Right. And they're using they're grasping the most powerful sources of power because they want the most power. And I think that, the ultimate way to kind of get this across is there's a reason why these people are called con men. Con stands for confidence. The
Right.
first thing you do when you want to manipulate someone, just watch, Better Call Saul. You win their confidence. You give them something. You always give something to the mark, right? And if you give them, I think, Naomi Klein's Doppelganger book is just so wonderful on this and how Steve Bannon does this. He prospects for people who feel um, heart pain, heart sick.
Hmm.
He gives them cures for it, right? And at its best, at its most politically effective, the left does that too, but to raise people up and not to beat them down, right? It gives them cures for their heart sickness that give them power, right? That doesn't say it's a bad guy we need to destroy, but we're going to work together to raise everyone up.
Well said. Thanks for writing these pieces, Rick Perlstein, and thanks so much for coming on the program. It was great to talk with you.
Right, next time. Cheers. Bye-bye.
And bye-bye. We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.